Last Friday, we discussed the first type of our vascular plants, okay, the gymnosperm. Today, we are going to talk about the second type, which is the angiosperms. Now, with the angiosperm, they are flowering plants. So as you can see up there, it says parts of a flower. So we are going to talk about the different parts of a flower and get some definitions on it. Then you are going to actually construct parts of a flower and label them on a diagram. All right? So, as we get started here, parts of a flower, we're going to start out with what we call the sepal. So find sepal on your chart and write down the definition for the sepal. The sepal is the outer leaf-like part of a flower that encloses the developing bud for protection. So, if I'm looking at this diagram right here, okay, these things right here, see the stem of the flower here? That is the stem. These are the sepals right here, the little protective parts that enclose the bud. Okay? Those are the sepals. The stem. Okay? The stem is also called a flower stalk or pedicel. Okay. If multiple flowers are connected to that one stem, that's when we call it a pedestal or a stalk. Okay? What the stem does is it supports the flower. The stem will support the flower. I think we can tell what the stem is here. This whole thing is that stem of this particular flower. We're all familiar with petals of a flower. Petals of a flower are the colorful structures which attract the pollinators. They act as a landing place for the polymers or the pollinators. Okay? Their final job is that they enclose the reproductive organs. So these petals attract the pollinators. What's a pollinator? Like a bee. Okay? It could be a bee. That bee sees the pretty color of the pollen, or maybe it wants to come in and eat a little bit of the nectar of the flower. So that pollinator lands onto these landing strips we call petals, and then it can help to pollinate different flowers. Okay? So the petals are the colorful flower structures that attract the pollinators. By definition here, it says that the receptacle is the end of the flower stalk to which all of the flower parts are attached. So if we look at this little flower right here, here is the stem coming in. Here is the stem coming in, which is also referred to as the flower stalk, depending on whether it was more or one. But here's the stem. We know that these are what? Those are the sepals. So in between the stem and the sepals right here is the receptacle. So this area right here, sepals, stem, and the receptacle is in between the sepals and the stem. Now, if we look at this particular diagram, Okay, see the sepals right here? See the receptacle right here? Right here is the stem. We're going to talk about female and male parts of the flower. Now, if you look at this right here, this structure right here that goes all the way up here and has that little top to it, this is the female part of the flower. Okay, see these guys right here? This thing and that right there, those four things, as we can see right there, are the male parts of the flower. All right, so we're going to talk about the female and the male parts of the flower. So, as I click it on, here are the female parts of the flower. Okay, if we would group the entire thing, the entire female reproductive parts of a flower, we would call that the pistil. The pistil. And the pistil consists of three parts that we're going to discuss here today. The first of which is the stigma. The stigma is the sticky part of the female reproductive organ that receives the pollen. Once again, the sticky part of the female organ that receives the pollen. So if I look back here, see here, right here is the stigma. That is where the pollinator, the bee it could be, hits that stigma, and it said it's the sticky part. So that bee could have got some pollen on it. When it flies in there and hits that stigma, it puts that pollen onto the stigma because of its stickiness. Okay? So the stigma is the sticky part which receives the pollen. The second part is the style. The style is the long tube that connects the stigma to the ovary. So if you look right here, here's the stigma, here's the ovary. So the style is that long part right in between here. Now in this picture, this live picture, you can see the stigma, but we can't see the ovary down here. But this whole big long thing is what we call the style right here. Okay? That is the style. Now, what happens is, we said right here that the stigma is in charge. It's a sticky thing where the pollens get stuck to. What happens then is something that we call a pollen tube starts to grow, and this pollen tube grows all the way down this style. Okay? So the pollen tube grows all the way down the style. Now, just a little note right here, okay? We just said that the pistil was the female reproductive parts. At times, that's also referred to as the carpel, C-A-R-P-E-L. Just remember that. And in this particular diagram, they're calling it the carpel, okay? The female reproductive parts. So the next part, we talked about the stigma, we talked about the style. Let's talk about the ovary. The ovary. Now, it describes the ovary with ovules. Okay? The ovary contains and protects the ovules. The pollen will come down and fertilize the ovules, and they will end up developing into seeds. Okay, what grows around to protect the seeds? The particular fruit that comes from whichever plant we have. So if you look at this diagram here, this little round part here at the bottom is the ovule, and see the little orange dots lining up and down, standing up and down here? Or excuse me, the whole big thing is the ovary. The ovules, I think I said that wrong, are those little orange dots. So this big circular thing is the ovary. The dots here that are orange are the ovules. If you look over here, these are the ovules, these little dots here, okay? And the ovary is this whole big round thing at the bottom base. And once again, the ovary protects the ovules. When fertilized, the ovules become seeds, okay? I'm sure you've ate an apple, haven't you? You've ate an apple before, and in the core of the apple, there are seeds, right? Okay, at one time, those were ovules. One time, those were ovules. Now, let's talk a little bit now about the male part of the plant. And as a whole, the male part of the plant is referred to as the stamen. Okay, the whole male part of the plant is the stamen. So we have the stamen and the pistil, or carpel. Now, the male stamen starts with the anther. If you look at this picture here, this whole thing circled is the stamen. And if you look, they have a little tops, which are the anthers, and kind of like stem-like projections here are the filaments. Here's a little better picture because you have this filament coming up through the middle of the flower, and here's the filament. Here is a greenish color, and this reddish orange color here is the anther. Now what the anthers are is it's made of 4 pollen sacs that produce pollen grains via meiosis. The pollen grains mature, and then the anther will split open. Once that anther splits open, the pollen grains are released, and they can be carried by air, they can be carried by water, they can be carried by some sort of a pollinator, whether it's a bee, could be a bird, okay, could be a bird, etc. So, when you hear, when do you hear people talk about and say, ooh, the pollen's really, really high? Okay? In the springtime. Why? Huh? That's when this stuff is going on, right? Okay? That's probably the biggest time of the year when these flowers are releasing pollen. Do we have much problem with pollen allergies during the winter? No, because you don't see a whole lot of flowers during the winter, do you? No. All right? So when we have these pollen makers here, the anther, when they split open, that's when the pollen gets into the air and can wreak havoc on people who have allergies. Mine haven't been too bad this year, but I've been getting allergy shots for a couple of years now. So hopefully they're working. Seem to be. Knock on wood. The filament is the second part of the male stamen. Okay? The filament. And what the filament is it's the thin stalk that supports the anther. So if you look at this live diagram of this flower, all these thin stalks down here are the filaments. And on the top of the filaments are these little orange puffier things there. Those are the anthers. And here's a little bit better diagram. We just talked about the anther. Here is that filament. But if you look at the anther, you can see the 4 different pollen sacs, and inside each pollen sac is the pollen grains that are undergoing meiosis, right? Meiosis right there. So that is the anther. Here is the filament, and the female part, the male part of the flower, which is the stamen.